So welcome to BuzzerCop. We're here to give you a briefing on HMRC's consultation. I think most people who are attending know who BuzzerCop are. But for anybody who's new to us, we're a single office, full service accountancy firm based in London. Although we're based all over the place at the moment, this is still working from home. And we've been around for 100 years, so we're quite a long-standing firm in London, and part of the specialisms within the firm is that we've built up teams such as the R&D team that will be talking to you today. But why we set up our call today, or the webinar today? Well, the Revenue have recently announced a review of the R&D tax credit scheme. So they do this via something called a consultation. This allows them to look at how the scheme is working, understand if there are issues or things that need to be looked at, and get input from the wider community of people who use the scheme to see whether it's meeting its purposes or not. So today we're going to go through an introduction to just introduce the R&D schemes, because it's both the SME and large company RDEC, or the Research and Development Expenditure Credit, that are involved in this. So we'll just go through that. We'll give you a brief background of why we're consulting on it, or why Revenue are consulting on it at the moment. And then the actual consultation's got 17 questions, and we've tried to group them into sort of 4 main areas, and we'll run through what those questions are and what Revenue are looking for. And finally, we'll just run through how to respond and the next steps after this webinar. So to start with, I'll get Luke from our R&D team to introduce the R&D schemes and just quickly run through what they're about.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I know that some of you are already claiming, and you probably have an understanding of the R&D tax credit scheme. But as Ian says, it's worth giving a brief overview refresher that will help frame the rest of the discussion. And I'll give an introduction to the 2 schemes so we can just see how they work. So, as Ian said, we've got the 2 schemes. We've got the SME scheme and the RDEC scheme, and both are really good at generating cash. So if I just start by giving a brief overview how they both work and the type of benefit they can generate. So the scheme for SME businesses is significantly more generous, with loss-making businesses able to claim 33% of the qualifying spend as cash. And this benefit then drops as business becomes profitable and stabilizes at around 25% for an SME. So HMRC are still working to their 28-day turnaround. There have been a few delays recently, and HMRC have put that down to the COVID restrictions and that leaving them with a backlog. But generally, they are still aiming for the 28-day turnaround to have the benefit paid out from submission of the R&D claim. And the RDEC scheme is available for funded work or large companies. So in some instances, an SME will be pushed into the large company scheme. And this can be either when they carry out work as a subcontractor, or they've received grant funding or other funding types for the work they're doing. So this is something HMRC can be quite pedantic on, and they're probably going to start taking a more extreme position on SME status. So it's always worth consulting with an advisor if you're unsure which scheme you should be using. And there are other things which can affect SME status, like having a complex ownership structure. So that's when SMEs have to claim in the RDEC scheme. But by and large, the RDEC scheme is there for large companies, and you're classified as a large company if you have either more than 500 staff, or you have a turnover that exceeds 100 million euros, or gross assets that exceed 80 million euros. So for a benefit of an RDEC claim, it's the same for loss-making and profitable business, and it's around 10% of the qualifying spend is cash. And the benefit is calculated as an above-the-line taxable credit, which is equal to 13% of the qualifying spend, and it's after tax, so that equals 10% of the qualifying spend. So it's still a good amount, but there is a significant difference between the SME benefit and the RDEC benefit. So while the benefit drops when you move into the RDEC scheme, there are other benefits that you have in the RDEC scheme that don't exist in the SME scheme. And that's mainly due to the fact that it's an above the line credit. So it improves measures such as EBIT, and profitability. So that can be really helpful if you want better visible profits prior to an investment round. So that was just a brief overview of the two schemes and what they mean and the type of benefit they can generate for your business. And I'll now pass back to Ian, who's going to introduce the different parts of the consultation before we go into the main discussion.
So thank you, Luke. That's quite a useful introduction to what I need to go through now. That the consultation is being set up as the schemes for the R&D tax credits have been around for 20 plus years nearly now. So the SME scheme came in 2000. The large company scheme appeared in 2002, which is the point at which they also defined what R&D is for tax purposes that you're probably going to be familiar with, the advance and uncertainties. But I think most businesses are well aware that their cost base have changed over that time. Things like hosting wouldn't have even been thought of at the time the scheme was set up. So it's been excluded just simply because it wasn't there and wasn't seen as a major part of the costs for a development company. What happened after that is in 2010, the coalition government had another review of the scheme, decided that the large company scheme wasn't working and set up the RDEC, so moved it above the line, and that's been running since around about 2013 and seems to be quite popular as a mechanism for providing relief to businesses. So in the summer, Revenue set up a review of all of the tax reliefs that they're running on the incentive side. And the RDEC review showed a net positive benefit, and it's definitely working better than a large scheme. However, the SME review showed a reducing benefit, and I think companies seem to be suggesting that there's less of a linkage between the credit they receive and the amount they will invest in R&D. And I think Revenue have taken away from that maybe there's some dead weight within that scheme and it's not working the way they want. So this has sort of driven the thoughts behind the review that we've got. But again, the other side of it is since 2000, many countries have set up their own R&D tax credit schemes. A lot of them have looked at the UK, Canada, Australia and decided, well, we'll try and make it more appealing and add in other costs and make it work in different ways. So the question that Revenue are asking is, do those schemes work better than the UK scheme? And should we make changes, structural changes to the way the scheme is working? So it's quite a wide-ranging, comprehensive consultation that will be probably looking at resetting the scheme for the next 10 years as these changes come through. So what have we done? We've gone off and asked a few of our clients their thoughts and got their input to what they think should happen. And we'll drop these in through the presentation. But if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts as we're going along, there's a Q&A chat that you can add your questions to, and you really want to get your input and your thoughts as we go along, just to see, do you agree with the sort of things we're hearing from our clients, or do you have other thoughts about how the scheme should be working, or are some of the questions not as relevant to you as maybe they were to the companies we were talking to? So I'm going to get Luke to kick off with the first set of questions, which is around harmonising schemes, sort of changing the way the benefit for SMEs will be generated, and see what your thoughts are on that. So I'm going to hand over to Luke now.
Yep, thanks, Ian. So this is the first part of the consultation, and it's looking at the operations and the structure of the scheme, and HMRC are looking to see how they can streamline it and simplify it to allow businesses to make best use of the benefits and also to get the best return on investment. So as we've already mentioned, the UK R&D tax credit scheme differs internationally in that we've got two schemes. So we've got the SME that provides the additional deduction, which most of you are probably familiar with. And then we have the RDEC scheme, which gives the above the line taxable credit, which is at a flat rate and shows up as income in the accounts. Now, as Ian pointed out, the data collected by HMRC suggests that the RDEC gives a better return on investment in terms of improving the R&D spend, and also that it's preferred by some businesses because it increases visible profits and has a simpler calculation. So the idea from HMRC would be to harmonise the schemes with an RDEC for all, and then potentially have a higher rate for SMEs. So, I mean, generally, when talking to SME businesses across a range of industries, they don't really seem to have any preference on how the benefit is paid out. So whether it comes in as an additional deduction, it comes in as above the line taxable credit, or is paid in separately from the tax system. But that being said, there are a few points worth considering when thinking about whether the scheme should be changed and be harmonised into an RDEC for all. So firstly, the RDEC is much more straightforward when calculating the benefit when compared to the SME scheme. So in the SME scheme, there's a complication due to the way the cashback is generated. And I think quite a few of our clients have been caught out by this. So if a company is heavily loss making, then the cashback is equal to around 33% of qualifying spend. This then drops to 19% for a break-even business, and then increases back to 25% for a highly profitable business. So essentially, this penalises businesses becoming marginally profitable. And it doesn't really make sense to limit the benefit for a business when they hit a really important growth phase. So if the schemes were harmonised with an above the line credit, this would remove that drop, and it would just mean that a business gets the same benefit if they're loss making, profit making, or marginally profitable. So it's worth considering it from that perspective. Particularly if you're at the stage where you're going through rapid growth and are potentially going to go from loss making to marginally profitable. What HMRC would like to know is, would having a single above the line credit scheme increase R&D investment? So as I said earlier, the evaluations from HMRC suggest that the RDEC scheme does generate a higher return on investment. But based on our discussions with clients, changing it to a single scheme with an above the line credit would just be an accounting issue, and wouldn't really have any impact on the way companies invest in R&D. Particularly for SME businesses and startups where everything is cash flow, it will be spent in the same way, whether that comes in as an additional deduction or it's above the line. So that's the feedback we've got. That might not be the case for everybody. So it's worth thinking about if it will be beneficial to have the benefit above the line, which would improve your visible profits and help out with things like funding rounds. So if you've got any ideas, or if you think that will work for you, put your comments in the Q&A box and we can discuss them at the end. But really, from speaking with people, it wouldn't really make a difference putting it above the line unless they were turning over 50 million plus a year. So the next consideration from HMRC around harmonising the schemes is, if the schemes were harmonised, would investment drop in the SME? Would investment drop if the SME scheme benefit was reduced? So there is potential for the SME benefit to drop. This is because HMRC have identified in their research that SMEs are not as concerned if the benefit reduces. And on top of that, HMRC also seem to think the SME scheme has a worse return on investment. Our experience would be different from this, and from speaking with businesses, we feel that the SMEs see the value in the current benefit, and it does form an important part of cash flow. It's important to think about that when responding to the consultation, because there is a risk that the SME scheme will reduce. And I guess, if HMRC were to drop the SME benefit, they would just have to accept that that amount would disappear from R&D investment in the private sector, because as things stand, most of the SME business we speak with put the R&D benefits straight back into R&D investment. So finally on this point, the next question is, would investment decisions continue even in the absence of the R&D tax credit scheme? Generally the consensus among businesses you speak to is that even if the R&D tax credit scheme didn't exist, they can still continue investing in innovation and development projects. And that's because the innovation is an integral part of their business model. So they see the R&D tax credit scheme as an enabling scheme that provides support to allow businesses to take their time and invest properly in their projects, but it doesn't encourage a business to undertake projects they wouldn't have been undertaking already. So really the scheme is something that helps with run rate and cash flow and enables the continuation of R&D. So it's important to communicate that back to revenue so they can understand the value of the scheme from the business perspective, and they can see why the SME scheme is important. But have a think about harmonising the scheme. Would an RDEP for all make sense for you? Would an above the line credit make a difference for you? And put any questions in the Q&A box and we can discuss them at the end. But I'm now going to pass back to Ian, who's going to run through the operations part of the consultation and looking at the scheme from that perspective.
Thanks, Luke. Yes, so the next set of questions is really moving on from that introduction around harmonising the scheme. And I think it's the point at which you need to sort of put your thinking cap on to think, how could the scheme be improved and how could it be made more certain and the operation work better for businesses? So the first question that revenue ask is, would there be benefits in removing the R&D tax credit from the tax return? So we see companies struggle to get the accounts and tax finished and can be waiting 9 months to actually get round to submitting the claim. So I think companies recognise that if there was a change and it made it easier to get the money quicker, then yes, that'd be good. But I don't think companies can quite see how that would be enabled or how that would work, whether it'd have to come through payroll or a grant-based system and somehow be decoupled from the tax return. But I think where we got some more interesting comments was revenue are asking, should there be a pre-approval system? Would that improve the certainty of the claim? Would that help you in your planning and budgeting for 3 or 5 years if that was in place? And coupled to that is, would it be helpful to have technical specialists to review the claims? Would that help in trying to understand whether the work is eligible? So there are a number of schemes around the world that have pre-approvals in them. They tend to be quite confrontational, unfortunately, and even the advanced assurance that's been set up by revenue is challenging and companies find it quite difficult to navigate. So although it would give more certainty, there seems to be a bigger hurdle of actually getting into that pre-approval stage. And definitely, if we go to technical specialists, I think if you speak to anybody who works for the Australian system, they would say that doesn't necessarily help, and it actually can make the system very confrontational, where 2 people from the same sector are arguing about whether they consider something as an advance or not. So yes, there are good ideas in here. How they work is going to be the key part to whether it actually makes the operation of the system better. And then actually we had other people coming out with more radical ideas that why couldn't the smaller companies potentially have something like an audit process where they go to revenue and say, we're a company that's undertaking R&D, we've had it checked, and now will you accept that we've got a valid claim in place? And maybe that works for the smaller claims. But again, revenue are going to be looking at this from the point of view of fraud, and would that encourage erroneous claims? Would it encourage companies to basically inflate claims and behave badly? So there's definitely 2 sides to this. Revenue are going to come from the protection side. Companies, I think, would like to see some changes there, but then there has to be a boundary where the claim is so big it needs to be checked, it needs to be reviewed. Then maybe the pre-approval route is one to look at. And I think revenue would be really interested in the views of companies as to how they think that could work, or what changes might be applicable to the UK scheme, or does the UK scheme work okay at the moment? We've had a couple of companies actually said to us, no, it seems to be fine, we're quite happy with the way it's working. So I think it's an interesting point. I'm not sure whether revenue will be comfortable to make the structural changes that could potentially radically overhaul the operations of the scheme, but they'll be interested to find out what you're thinking. The other area that revenue are asking about is advisors and whether companies feel they're getting the support they need. And in particular, revenue are asking, should there be regulation of the advisors? I think everybody we've spoken to said yes, that probably would be quite a good idea to have that in place. But revenue are also concerned about contingent fees. And again, if we go back to Australia, they have effectively been banned because you now have to declare what fee structure you've worked on with your advisor. So I think revenue are looking at that and wondering, do contingent fees encourage bad behaviour, or do clients and companies find that a better way to pay for the work that's been undertaken? And in general, I think we see companies being quite positive around the contingent fee one. Otherwise, I think some companies quite keen on fixed fees because they don't know what they're going to pay every year. So again, it'd be interesting to know if you've got any questions, if you've got any thoughts on this, it'd be good to put them into the Q&A section. But again, this is very much open-ended as to where revenue are looking to go with this. So I think this is one's going to be quite a difficult section for companies to fill in, and it's one that I can imagine there being a very diverse range of opinions. But the next section is probably coming back again to a more straightforward question as to what revenue should be doing in terms of expanding the scheme and expanding the costs that can be claimed. And Katrina will take over and cover this section of the consultation.
Thanks, Ian. So yeah, as Ian said, the next part of the consultation covers the possibility of expanding the scope of the costs included in the R&D scheme. So as we've already spoken about, the definition of R&D was set out in 2002, and compared to then, businesses work in completely different ways, and the common utility costs of businesses are completely different. Building upon that, the consultation also then goes on to consider whether this definition needs updating, either for clarity or to widen what's covered by the reliefs. So, for example, in utility costs, currently you can claim utility costs for power, heat and water, but other common costs such as telephony, internet and rentals can't be included. We don't feel this reflects the way businesses work now, and having spoken to some of our clients, they feel the same. It doesn't really make much sense. So if you feel the same way, then it'd be good to get that across in the consultation. Or if you have a different opinion, then please do let us know in the Q&A box. They then go on. They've also already considered widening the scope beyond this to also include things like data, cloud computing and hosting. These are all costs which we come across quite a lot with our clients that they can't include, and they are quite big costs in their R&D work. So please have a think about that. Highlight any other costs you feel should be included, or ones that you don't feel should be included, and put those in the Q&A box. Would be great to know. It would also be good for you to consider if you feel like any of your R&D work is maybe limited by the cost that you can't include. So, for example, if you're considering a piece of work, but that requires renting a large piece of equipment and you won't receive any benefit for that, and you can't afford to buy the piece of equipment outright, that's a good way of thinking about those sorts of costs. The next thing the consultation goes on to talk about is whether allowing capital expenditure in the R&D reliefs would increase the investment into R&D. So some countries already include capital expenditure. So Ireland, Portugal and Austria, for example, all allow plant and machinery. The clients we've spoken to tend to think that actually this wouldn't make a difference in their R&D investment, because they're kind of moving away from investing in plant and machinery and moving more towards renting equipment and things like that, and that would actually be more beneficial to be included in their R&D claim. The next thing it goes on to talk about is if there needs to be a widening of the scope of the qualifying indirect activities. So, for example, IP protection isn't currently covered in the R&D schemes, and if that's something you feel should be. So what the government really wants to do is include all costs that really contribute to the innovation and advance in R&D. So currently you can include costs for maintenance and support, but not, as we said, IP protection. So I think the good way to think about it is what you feel really puts the most influence in your innovation and really helps that advance. And if there's costs which could be restricted to make other costs other costs that are more important. So next, the consultation goes on to talk about a regional focus. So I'll pass you on to Luke, who will talk a bit more about that.
Thanks, Katrina. So yeah, as Katrina said, next in the consultation, HMRC are looking at regional and sector focus, and in particular, they're asking questions around the levelling up agenda and green technologies. So, I mean, really, this is where HMRC are asking if the R&D tax credit scheme can be used to push wider policy outcomes and rectify various market failures. So just as an international comparison, other countries like Spain and Portugal have created their systems to give varied rates across different sectors, and the benefit is paid out based on various policy outcome criteria. So essentially, HMRC are asking how successful could a tax incentive scheme be in changing business behaviour and the way businesses invest in R&D. So firstly, would a scheme structured to incentivise certain regional location encourage businesses to move away from London and the southeast? So if HMRC were to offer a more generous credit to companies in less affluent regions, would that incentivise anyone to move? So the feedback we have is that would be far too ambitious for a tax credit scheme, and the benefit would need to be massive to incentivise a move to a region where there isn't really any other infrastructure or high technology sectors where businesses can plug into like they can in London and the southeast. So there are lots of things keeping companies in London and the southeast. So that's things like talent, networks, various sector ecosystems, and they don't see the scheme as so significant that it would allow them to move away from London and the southeast and into another region just off the back of the R&D tax credit scheme. That would be too much to ask. And on top of that, doing it would introduce a different set of complexities where, if you have a company headquartered in London with a factory in a northern region, where would the funding go? How would it be managed? And would it even actually achieve the outcome of levelling up by directing a greater level of R&D funding into a region outside of London, the southeast? So yeah, we haven't really spoken with anyone who would support a regional focus in the R&D tax credit scheme. And it's important to communicate that to HMRC because there could potentially be a drop in the benefit available in London compared to other places if HMRC go ahead with this. But on the flip side, you may have an idea of how the R&D tax credit scheme could be used to level up. And it'd be good to hear your thoughts on that as well. So if you've got any comments there, put it in the Q&A box and we could discuss it at the end. Because there are other potential negative impacts on this where you could have things like leveling down, and perhaps if companies are moving into different regions, then the universities of London perhaps wouldn't get as many applicants because the northern regions become more appealing. So the next part of the consultation is asking, should certain sectors be identified for more support where there are structural funding issues? So they're asking here, can the tax credit scheme be used to better support companies developing high risk, high potential technologies and energy solutions and things like nuclear technology, where it takes a long time to achieve commercialization, and the development phase is a pure spend with no income. So if you think the scheme could be designed to support those types of sectors, have a think and put some comments in the Q&A box. And finally, on this part of the consultation, they're asking, should social and environmental factors be incorporated into the scheme? So do you think the R&D tax credit scheme could be better used to incentivize R&D with a specific social value, and things like developing green technologies? I mean, internationally, there aren't really any R&D schemes set up that recognize social science and pure environmental work, but HMRC are really keen to use the R&D tax credit scheme in this way and to help generate positive externalities on top of innovation. So, if you can think of activity that generates an economic value as well as other positive impacts that could be included in an R&D claim, put that into the Q&A box. We could discuss it at the end, and it will be a really good idea to flag that in the consultation when responding. Because I know we work with companies in various sectors that do undertake projects which have a sustainability and an environmental element, and there is potential value in recognising it in the R&D tax credit scheme. But on the flip side, you have to think, how would that work, and is that going to be too complex to implement? So that's a good discussion point, and put your comments in the Q&A box. But I'm now going to pass back to Ian, who's going to discuss the possibility of the R&D tax credit scheme becoming a UK first tax credit scheme, and how that could impact your business, and what our clients have said when we've discussed it with them.
Sorry, this section's not it's not too surprising in terms of what we're seeing. We see lots of claims where overseas costs are included, and we then look at either externally provided workers or subcontracted work that's being passed out to either a subsidiary or a third-party company overseas. I think the question Revenue are asking and the government are asking is, should the UK tax system be incentivizing that type of work? So we've asked quite a few companies, what is it that's driving that type of expenditure? And I think in the main, it's around finding it difficult to recruit technical resources. Maybe there's a lack of staff in the UK with the right qualifications, or otherwise we simply don't have the infrastructure to undertake the work. So when you're looking at the semiconductor sector, it's very difficult to get prototypes produced in the UK. There are a few fabs that can produce that, but you're more likely to go to somewhere like Taiwan and get the prototypes and early production units produced there. So I think Revenue do understand that, and their question is that feasible to put in place? Do we put a blanket ban in? Can we identify essential work that's being contracted out? Can we make it work for companies so that we don't restrict the R&D that maybe we can't do in the UK and we have to pass out to overseas because it's there where the skill sets are sitting? So I think a lot of companies do undertake the work overseas for those reasons. But Revenue then want to know, well, what impact would such a restriction have on UK investments? Other countries do have these restrictions in place, and their schemes are fairly popular. I don't know whether they're quite as popular as the UK one in certain respects, because I think if you're looking maybe at Australia and other places like that, there are less opportunities now with their scheme. So we've asked that question to our clients, and I think we've had a varied response actually on this one. If the company is UK based, it's quite well linked into the UK university system, they're not struggling for talent and they don't really feel this is going to impact them. The same really with some of the architecture firms we speak to. Again, they're very much UK focused with their staff and can bring the talent into the UK to help and work with them. However, when we move across to the tech sector, we got quite a different opinion that this could actually make companies move, that the talent at the right price is mainly overseas. They really struggle to compete with the likes of Google and Microsoft in the UK to get the right qualifications and skill sets, and it makes it very difficult to keep the business running in the UK with just UK staff. So potentially that could move investment elsewhere. So I think it'd be interesting to know what your thoughts are on this. Is it one that will cause a problem? Is it one that really is not going to make any difference to your business? It's one that we definitely had such a big diverse opinion on. It was very interesting, and we can't really find a common ground between the views that we're getting. So that's the final area, looking at restricting costs to the UK only and making it focused on UK staff and UK expenditure. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide, which is talking about how do you respond to the consultation. So I guess a lot of companies are unfamiliar with responding to consultations. They don't happen that often and they tend to be quite technical. But this one is broad brush. It's looking at the whole working of the scheme. So we would encourage companies to try and respond if they can. The final date for responses is the 2nd of June. So there's a fair amount of time to look at that, but it's worth trying to get your thoughts together and think about how you'd respond. You don't have to respond to all the questions. I mean, 17 questions is quite a lot to ask. If there are key ones that you feel you want to have a say on, then respond to those questions and send them across to Revenue, your thoughts across to Revenue. I think the main thing Revenue want is they want to see responses from all sizes of business. They know they're going to get responses from the large corporates. They have teams dedicated to preparing R&D claims, and they'll be already getting ramped up to putting their responses in. They want to see how this will impact to all businesses, and it will impact them, and it could impact them for the next 10 years, given the way these consultations have worked in the past. So if you would like to put a response in, we can help you with that process and guide you on what you need to do. However, I know some companies would like more of an anonymized response across to Revenue. And we're more than happy to try and pull together a joint response for all of our clients and contacts. Again, if you want that, then please get in touch and we can try and pull something together.